Okay, let's unpack this. $129 million. That's apparently what the Alaska purchase would cost you today.
Yeah, it's a big number now.
But the original price, about 2 cents per acre, like 36 cents in today's dollar. For, a chunk of land bigger than California, Texas, and Montana combined.
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it?
Totally. Was this the deal of the century? A brilliant strategic move? Or, like people calling it Seward's icebox?
Well, that question, that basic question of value and vision, that's exactly what we're plunging into today.
Right.
We're doing a deep dive into the Alaska Purchase of 1867, using information primarily from the Wikipedia pages on the purchase itself and the history of Alaska, just to try and grasp its real significance.
Absolutely. And we're going beyond just the basic facts you might remember from school. The goal here is to really dissect the motivations, why Russia sold, why the U.S. bought, and how people actually reacted back then, because, believe me, it wasn't all chairs. And then, of course, the long-term impact.
We're looking for those surprising details, the stuff that maybe challenges that Seward's folly narrative.
Exactly. Was it genius or just odd?
So, to really get it, you first have to understand Russia's position. Why were they even in Alaska?
Good point.
Well, their presence in North America actually goes way back, like early 18th century. It started with these guys called Promišleniky.
Promišleniky.
Yeah, basically merchants and fur trappers, really rugged individuals pushing east, chasing furs.
Okay, so fur trade was the driver.
Big time. And then things got more formal around 1799 with the Russian-American company, the RAC.
Right, the RAC. But here's the kicker. Wasn't the actual Russian population tiny? Like controlling this massive area with hardly anyone there?
That's a crucial point. You're talking maybe 700 Russians, settlers, and administrators trying to enforce sovereignty over this huge territory.
Right. Just 700?
Precisely. And by the mid-1800s, things were getting difficult for Russia there. Several factors came together. Well, first, the Crimean War. They lost. And it really showed how hard it would be to defend Alaska, especially against the British Navy.
Because Britain had Canada right next door.
Exactly. A major naval power close by. That was a big worry.
Makes sense. Defense is tough when you're that far away and outnumbered.
Yeah.
What else?
Money troubles.
Yes.
Big money troubles.
Yeah.
The sea otters, which were like the main cash cow for the RAC, their population had crashed. We're talking maybe 300,000 at the peak, down to almost nothing by the 1850s. Overhunting.
So the main revenue source just dried up.
Pretty much, which made the whole colony way less viable financially.
Okay, so defense problems, money problems.
And fear. Fear of a gold rush. They saw what happened in California.
Yeah, the 49ers.
They were terrified that if gold was found in Alaska, Americans or Canadians would just flood in and they'd be completely overwhelmed. There was this phrase, Siberia's Siberia.
Siberia's Siberia. Wow, that tells you how remote they felt it was.
It does. It highlights the isolation and how hard it would be to control any kind of rush.
So they felt vulnerable militarily, financially, and just demographically, I guess.
Yeah, and there was also a strategic angle. Some in Russia actually thought selling to the Americans could be a way to sort of check British power.
How so?
Well, putting American territory right up against British Columbia, which had that big Royal Navy base at Esquimalt.
Create a buffer or maybe a point of friction between the U.S. and Britain.
Kind of, yeah. A geopolitical chess move, almost, weakening their main rival.
Interesting. So this wasn't just a sudden decision then?
Not at all. Grand Duke Constantine, the Tsar's brother, he was pushing for a sale way back in 1857. He wrote this memo, basically saying, look, the U.S. wants all of North America. They're going to take Alaska eventually anyway. We might as well sell it before we lose it for nothing.
So even within the Russian leadership, there was this sense of inevitability.
Definitely. Now, Tsar Alexander II, he agreed in principle, but some officials, like the foreign minister Gorchakov, they wanted to maybe take it slower, but the pressure to sell was building.
Okay, so Russia's got solid reasons to want out. Let's flip to the U.S. side. William Seward, Secretary of State. He's the key figure, right?
He absolutely is. After the Civil War, things quieted down enough for him to really pursue this. He started talks with the Russian minister here, Eduard de Stockel.
And it happened pretty fast, didn't it?
Amazingly fast, yeah. Treaty signed March 30th, 1867 in D.C. Senate ratified it in May, and the U.S. officially took over on October 18th that same year.
So what was Seward's big idea? Why did he want this seemingly remote piece of land?
His main vision was Asia. He saw the Pacific Ocean as the next great theater for American trade and, well, power.
Okay.
And Alaska With its location, he saw it as a vital stepping stone, a base for American ships and influence across the Pacific.
So not just land for land's sake, but strategic positioning.
Exactly. It's about future projection, future trade. And, there had been some earlier American interest. Senator Gwynn from California had apparently floated a price of $5 million a few years before.
Oh, interesting. So that idea wasn't totally out of the blue for the U.S. either.
No, but the timing was right after the war.
Why $7.2 million, though, if Gwynn suggested $5 million earlier?
Well, a few things. The Civil War was over, so the U.S. could focus outwards again. Russia was definitely eager to sell by then.
Right.
And there's also a theory that President Johnson and Seward saw it as maybe a useful distraction.
A distraction from what?
From Reconstruction.
Yeah.
All the political fighting happening after the Civil War, a big, bold foreign policy move could maybe shift the focus a bit.
A bit of political maneuvering on the home front, too. Plausible.
Could be part of it. So they agreed on $7.2 million for, 586,000 square miles, which works out to that crazy low price per acre.
2 cents. It still blows my mind. You'd think everyone in America would have been thrilled, right? Get this huge territory for basically nothing.
You'd think so, but nope. The reaction was really mixed, polarized, actually.
Okay.
Sure, some people saw the potential, the trade, the strategy, just like Seward. But a lot of others, they just ridiculed it.
And that's where we get Seward's Folly and Seward's Icebox.
Exactly. Those nicknames stuck. Critics just hammered the idea of spending millions on what they called a frozen wasteland, a polar bear garden.
A polar bear garden?
Yeah, or the New York World called it a sucked orange, basically. Worthless, except for maybe a few leftover furs. Why buy this remote, disconnected piece of ice? That was the argument.
So that negative view, the folly idea, it got a lot of press.
It did, and historian Ellis Paxson Oberholzer wrote about how widespread that kind of newspaper criticism seemed.
Was that the whole story? Was everyone really that down on it?
Well, that's the interesting thing historians have found looking back. That narrative of universal condemnation. It's largely a myth.
Oh, so it wasn't that unpopular.
Apparently not. If you actually look at the newspapers from the time, a majority were either supportive or kind of neutral, especially on the West Coast in California.
Why California?
They saw potential. Minerals, maybe. But also closer ties with Russia, and maybe, just maybe, it would help eventually annex British Columbia.
Whoa, annexation. That was part of the thinking.
For some, definitely. About 45% of the supportive papers mention that as a benefit, getting closer to squeezing Britain out of BC. And papers like the New York Times are actually on board with Seward's trade vision, too.
So the loud critics got the memorable sound bites, but maybe didn't represent the majority view.
It seems that way. The opposition was vocal, sure, but it might have been more of a minority, maybe tied up in the politics of Reconstruction and general opposition to Seward and Johnson.
Okay, that really changes the picture. It wasn't universally mocked. Now, let's step back to right before the transfer. What was life actually like in Russian America?
Well, like we said, sparsely populated by Russians, mostly fur traders from the RAC.
Mm-hmm.
You also had some Russian Orthodox missionaries doing important work, actually. They translated religious texts into Aleut pretty early on.
That's significant.
Yeah, and a small military garrison. But the main settlements were tiny. New Archangel, which is Sitka now.
Right.
In 1867, it had maybe 968 residents, around 116 log cabins. Not exactly a bustling metropolis.
No kidding. And the other place?
St. Paul, in the Pribilof Islands. That was the center for seal fur. About 100 homes, maybe 283 people.
Seals, right.
And then scattered around, maybe 23 small trading posts, often with just 4 or 5 Russians each.
Wow. It's amazing they held it for so long. Seward estimated the total population, including native Alaskans, was around 60,000.
That was his estimate, yeah. The vast majority were, of course, the indigenous peoples, Tlingit, Haida, Aleut, Yupik, Inuit, and others, living their own lives largely outside direct Russian control.
Okay, so the transfer itself. October 18th, 1867, in Sitka. That must have been quite a scene.
Oh, for sure. And we actually have a first-hand account from a Finnish blacksmith who was there, Thomas Holland.
Really? What does he say?
He described the American ships arriving, the soldiers landing, and the actual flag ceremony. Apparently, the Russian flag, the double-headed eagle, it got tangled on the flagpole coming down.
No way! Like, it didn't want to leave?
Maybe. Took a bit of effort to get it down before they could raise the American flag with all the cannon salutes and everything.
Yeah.
A bit awkward, I guess.
A funny little detail and a huge historical moment.
Exactly. Then the Russian captain, Peshurov, formally handed over the territory to the American General Rousseau. Buildings, forts, all transferred.
Did many Russians stay?
Not many. A few traders, some Orthodox priests, chose to stay, but most Russian citizens decided to go back to Russia.
And Aland, the blacksmith, he left too.
He did. And his account of the journey back sounds rough. Overcrowded ship, the winged arrow. Apparently the crew drank a lot at every stop.
Oh, dear.
They went via the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii, then Tahiti, Brazil, London. Took almost 2 years to get back to Kronstadt in Russia.
2 years. That really shows you the distance and the disruption this caused for people.
Absolutely. And there was that weird calendar thing, too.
Oh, yeah. The date change.
Yeah, because Russia used the Julian calendar and the U.S. used the Gregorian, plus crossing the international date line. They basically skipped 11 days. Or rather, they lived through Friday, October 6th, and the very next day was Friday, October 18th.
2 Fridays in a row. How confusing must that have been?
Right. A unique little historical footnote.
So the handover is done, flag swapped, calendars fixed. What happened next? Did Americans rush in? Was it an immediate boom?
Not exactly. There was an initial rush, yes. Settlers, prospectors, business types heading north, expecting quick riches. But many were disappointed. Alaska's resources were there, obviously, but they weren't easy to get at. Required investment, time, and similar stuff could often be found easier elsewhere in the U.S. West.
So Sitka actually shrank for a while.
Yeah, the population declined in those first few years after the purchase. The boom didn't really happen right away.
But then came the Klondike, right? Late 1890s. That must have changed everything.
Completely. The Klondike Gold Rush started in '96, technically in Canada's Yukon Territory.
Right, next door.
But Alaska became the main gateway.
Yeah.
All the prospectors, the supplies, they had to go through Alaska. Towns like Skagway and Daya boomed.
Yeah.
It put Alaska firmly on the map and brought tons of people and investment.
So the gold rush, even though it wasn't in Alaska initially, it really kickstarted its development under the U.S.
Absolutely. And even before Klondike, that seal fishery in the Pribilofs, that actually turned out to be pretty lucrative for the U.S. government.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, the revenue the U.S. got just from leasing the sealing rights, within a couple of decades, it actually paid back more than the original $7.2 million purchase price.
Get out. So just the seals paid for Alaska?
In terms of direct revenue, back to the Treasury from that one source, yeah. But it also caused trouble.
Trouble?
The Bering Sea controversy with Britain. Disagreements over sealing rights on the open seas led to international arbitration.
Okay, so resource extraction starts, but it's complicated. Even with the gold rush and the seals, there's still this debate today about whether Alaska was a good financial deal for the U.S. government, isn't there?
There is. It's complex. Some economists look at the total cost purchase price plus interest, plus all the money the federal government has spent administering Alaska over the years. And they argue that the direct taxes and royalties coming back to the federal treasury haven't actually covered those costs. So maybe not a positive return on investment for the government itself.
But that sounds like a really narrow way to look at it, doesn't it?
Exactly. Others argue that's missing the point. You have to look at the total economic benefit to the nation.
Right. The jobs, the resources developed, the overall GDP contribution.
All of that. Plus, they point out if you use that strict federal ROI metric, a lot of other Western states might look like bad investments too.
Good point. So financially, it depends heavily on how you frame the question. What about politically? How did Alaska become a state?
It was a slow process. First, it was the Department of Alaska in 1867. Then the District of Alaska in 1884. Didn't become an organized territory until 1912.
Wow, 1912.
And then full statehood didn't happen until January 3rd, 1959. Took a long time.
Nearly a century after the purchase, and since statehood, Alaska's had a pretty dramatic history, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah. The historical sources mention so many key events. World War II was huge, with the Japanese actually occupying parts of the Aleutian Island.
Right, the Forgotten Front.
Then the massive 1964 Good Friday earthquake. Devastating.
I remember reading about that.
The discovery of oil at Prudhoe Bay in 1968, that changed everything. Led to the Trans-Alaska Pipeline.
Huge economic impact.
Definitely. Then there's the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, ANCSA, in the 70s, settling land claims. The Exxon Valdez oil spill in '89, a major environmental disaster.
Yeah.
And the ongoing debates about drilling in ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Even, the recent impact to the COVID-19 pandemic reaching Alaska.
Yeah.
It just shows how much has happened there, how significant it remains.
Absolutely. And they still celebrate Alaska Day, October 18th, the anniversary of the transfer.
They do. A reminder of that pivotal day.
So let's circle back. Was it a steal? Strategic genius? Seward's folly? Where do we land after digging into it?
Well, it's clearly way more complex than just folly, right?
Yeah.
It seems like it was driven by very real strategic concerns on both sides. Russia needed out, the U.S. saw an opportunity, and while the initial reaction in the U.S. was mixed, and those negative nicknames are catchy,
They stuck around.
they did. But the purchase has undeniably proven to be massively valuable in the long run. Economically, strategically, it shaped American history.
So calling it a folly really misses the mark based on everything that came after. Maybe it was debated, maybe a bit of a gamble at the time, but definitely not foolish in hindsight.
I think that's fair to say. It was a calculated move with immense long-term payoffs.
Which leaves you with a pretty interesting final thought, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Imagine if it hadn't happened. If Russia had held on or sold it to someone else, maybe Britain, how different would North America look today?
Whoa. Yeah, that's a big what if. Who controls those resources, that strategic Arctic territory? What does that mean for U.S. expansion, for global power dynamics?
It really makes you appreciate how that one transaction in 1867 set the stage for so much that followed, something to really chew on.